You have an idea. You want to tell it to the world, but you don't know where to start. That's where Anchor comes in. They have the tools for you to edit, produce, and record your idea right from your phone or computer. It's the easiest way to reach and grow your audience. They publish for you to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major platforms. And to top it all off, they match you with advertisers so you can earn from your passion and your wonderful idea. So tell me, what are you waiting for? Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started and follow your dream. Welcome to Disruptive Adventism. My name is Jose Briones, and I'll be your host for this podcast. This podcast is about discussing the polemical statements and practices that are part of the Adventist fabric, which in turn shape this belief system to be unique and relevant for today's society. During today's podcast, we'll be covering Annual Council with David Hamstra. David Hamstra is an Adventist minister on academic leave. We hope that you enjoy our podcast, and with nothing else to say, let us begin. Thanks again, everyone, for tuning in to Disruptive Adventism. This week is a little bit special. We don't have a series introduction, but we'll be covering Annual Council. Annual Council is an event that happens every year where leaders from the Seventh-day Adventist Church come and they discuss different issues. So today we have invited an Adventist minister that is on academic leave. His name is David Hamstra, and we have invited him so we can speak about this event and why is it important that we keep an eye throughout this week and to the events that occur. David, how's it going?
Not too bad. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. Before we start, just give us a little bit of background about yourself. You are a minister, but you're on academic leave. What does that mean, and how does that interact?
Yeah, more or less. I've had a pastoral career in Canada, though I myself am a Yank, as they might call us up there. And the conference has given me a period of time to work on a doctoral degree here at Andrews University, doing a Doctor of Theology in Theological and Historical Studies. So, yeah, that's a lot of fun. I tell people I go to Disneyland for theologians every day.
Okay, cool. That's awesome. That's an interesting way to put it. So let's kind of get started on our topic about Annual Council. So what is Annual Council? Like, I give a short introduction, but can you expand a little bit more on what is it? What is the main section? What is going to be happening this week?
Yeah, so I think maybe the best way to look at Annual Council by analogy would be like a church board meeting for the entire global Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Okay.
Except instead of it being a working board where, you know, you've got your personal ministries and Sabbath school leaders all there, it's a representative board. So it collects the highest level representatives of the various constituencies in the church, which are decision-making bodies, and in this case, it's the union conferences. And not all of them, of course, have constituencies. Some are union missions, so these people have an appointed office. But all those presidents get together every year and make decisions about how things are going to best work in our world church.
As you say that, you know, they meet every year, but this year is a little bit different. Following, 2015, there's a lot of events that have been occurring since the vote in San Antonio.
Right.
And why is it that this year a lot of outlets, media outlets in the Seventh-day Adventist Church have put a lot of emphasis? Why is it so relevant? I mean, this has been happening since the first time that they met and after the 1800s, right? Like they've been meeting every year, all the union, like as we have expanded as a global church. But why is it 2018 a crucial moment for the Adventist Church? Why is it so important? Why do we need to pay attention to this Annual Council?
Well, I think to get to that, you've got to tell the story of it, right? So for those who don't know what happened in San Antonio, there was a motion on the floor that would have allowed divisions of the church, which is the divisions of the General Conference, to allow for the ordination of women pastors, of which the Adventist Church already has. They just can't be ordained, which in essence means They cannot or are not supposed to be conference presidents or organize or disband churches. And that motion that would have allowed divisions to decide that within our territory we will ordain women was defeated there. And now we have 2 unions that are ordaining women pastors here in North America. We also have some European unions that are taking a different approach with their women pastors. But for the purposes of this discussion, maybe it's easiest to just focus on the North American unions because they have gone the furthest, shall we say, toward that step of ordaining women, which they are just have fully been doing from even before San Antonio. Okay. And the question is then before the annual council, now that we have taken this vote not to allow divisions to have this variance, what are we going to do with these unions that are ordaining women? Mm-hmm. Do we just turn a blind eye to it, or do we try to get them to stop, or what? And it's a thorny issue because according to the disciplinary procedures that are in the GC policy, you basically have to treat them like you would a church member that just refuses to listen. You say, bye-bye, it was nice knowing you. You're welcome to come back if you change your ways. But, but it seems like women's ordination is not a big enough issue that would merit kicking a union out of the church, right? Nobody really wants to take that step. And so then what do we do? And so the General Conference top-level administration, I would include the president in that, and some of his advisors had come up with this plan to have a graduated process of discipline. Mm-hmm. And that came out just before it was to be voted on at last year's annual council. And there was a lot of dissatisfaction about the way it was presented and perhaps what the consequences of it might be. That was voted down. So what they did in the meantime is a poll of all the union presidents. Do you think it's a good idea to try to discipline these unions that are ordaining women in some way? And they got back some indication that there would be some support for that. And they've tried to go ahead and implement now a new disciplinary procedure. And that's going to be up for discussion at this upcoming annual council, likely on Sunday, according to my best information. Okay,
cool. That is Sunday. This will be published on Monday, October the 8th. Is that 9th? I think that's how it's going to be. Well, so this week we're going to have a couple of extra meetings, and we're going to be defining this. So it seems to me that there is this issue, right? Like, we voted as a church to not allow the divisions to ordain women, but we still have women pastors, and some unions are deciding, well, we still have women pastors and we kind of want to ordain them as well, which goes against the vote to a certain degree. The vote because they don't have that power.
It goes against the spirit of the vote, not the letter of the vote. Now, the unions will argue that the General Conference policy nowhere expressly forbids the ordination of women. What it does is use the male pronoun when it talks about ordination. There's also a clause in the policy that says that there's non-discrimination in the Adventist Church on the basis of gender and some other categories. And so they will say, well, we need to interpret this and this. So they have a way of saying, look, this door has not been fully closed by policy, and we're interpreting policy in such a way as that it can be done, right? Now, they will say, well, that really goes against the spirit of the vote. And if you had put the question to that group in San Antonio, which they were too diplomatic to do, it probably would have gotten voted down, right? But the idea is, when it comes to church policy, it is this sort of thing that we fall back on when goodwill fails. And the question is then, what is the thing to do that would maintain goodwill in the church so that we can work together and cooperate, not try to find legalistic loopholes, right? But also respect one another's differences and variety, and allow for variations in conscience. Maybe I can put it that way, because conscience has come up as a category in this discussion, which should be respected, right? People say, well, we really feel that to exclude women from ordination is ethically wrong. And this being an issue that for them seems to be non-essential to church unity. Well, why shouldn't this be allowed to take place? So I don't know if that muddies the waters a little bit more in this discussion. But yeah, there is a sense in which the unions ordaining women went against the spirit of the vote in San Antonio, but they would argue they have not gone against the letter of any church policies.
So the policy, while it does not say you cannot ordain, it doesn't also say you can ordain. So we are kind of entering into more an interpretation issue, right?
Right.
So it's whether the union interprets, hey, this is the best way to approach this topic or not. So there's a little bit of like, how should we interpret? It's kind of like a biblical, but even then, this section, this vote, this issue, quote unquote, is not big enough to say, hey, we're just going to take it out. It's not as if the unions are saying, we don't believe in Christ. We don't believe in the Holy Spirit. Like, it's not that same level of heresy per se, because it's more of like a matter of policy. So it's playing a little bit of politics to a certain degree and seeing like, we're interpreting this way, you guys are interpreting that way. And now we have this document that is allowing for censorship or allowing for communication to be more in a process rather than just like you're disobeying or you're not disobeying. It's more like so what do we do? What do we do with people that are maybe interpreting the policy a little bit different? And what happens with our interactions with those people? Do we redeem them? Do we kick them out? What do we do? That's what I'm gathering from you in a summary, in a short way. There's other issues, but yes.
Yeah.
So what happens if the vote goes yes? So what does that give? More power to the General Conference to do things? Is it more of what happens? How does it affect the unions? How does it affect their relationship? Is it going to be a little bit more difficult to communicate? Are we going to see the church divided because of the vote in annual council? What happens if it goes yes, and what happens if it goes no? How do we relate to those?
Yeah, I mean, unity in the church has been the big theme of discussion following San Antonio, and how is it maintained? What is its basis? And what roles and responsibilities do different levels and entities and positions have in fostering unity? So, first of all, it's not exactly clear to me that a vote is being asked for in annual council this time.
Okay.
Because there is, along with an executive committee of the General Conference, which is like the church board, there is also an administrative committee, which consists of the elected officers and their associates and so forth.
President, vice president, treasurer, those people.
Those groups. You don't find that at the local church level in the Adventist church, but it is on every level up where you have these elected officers. And that this document has been voted by that committee, which is going to be discussed at the executive committee. It's not clear exactly what will be called for there or how that's going to play out. There's parliamentary procedure that gets involved, and it can get complicated. But what the document essentially lays out is a tiered level of disciplinary procedures, starting with a warning.
Okay. And
then in the next level, what they're proposing is that whenever the president or representative of a constituency that's considered to be out of compliance is going to speak, they will say this person is out of compliance, kind of like a naming and shaming approach.
That seems to be a little bit, at least in my opinion, improper to a certain degree. If we are all in a meeting, and will it be announced before, or is that how it's layered down? Like, if I go to a meeting, I'm a union president that is out of compliance, quote unquote. All of a sudden, before my name is announced, I get this label. Like, I get this out of compliance label. before I get the mic. Is that what I'm gathering?
Yeah, that seems to be it. And again, what they're envisioning is that as you go through these different steps, there's all this consultation taking place, and they're trying to labor with this non-compliant entity to bring it back into compliance. And then from there, you would go into perhaps greater levels where their standing in the committee would be removed, right? Where you couldn't speak or you couldn't vote. Those kinds of measures might come into play. I'll be interested to see what's actually brought to the floor to be looked at. And then finally, you would move through to the step of, like separations or something like that, which I think but I think the point is to try to apply some pressure to the leaders of these constituencies to get their people back in line with, now, there's one thing we haven't discussed is how do you know if an entity is out of compliance? Well, for that, they've created these compliance committees, right, which have an investigatory mandate to, and I guess what I would consider to be an interpretive mandate as well, right? To say, this is what policy is actually saying. Are you doing what we think it says? If you're not, then they bring a recommendation to the group, and I think they're going to require about a 2/3 majority something vote to implement these disciplinary procedures on entities that have been deemed out of compliance by the compliance committees.
So it doesn't seem that it's only like a slap in the wrist. It's not just like, oh, you're out of compliance, so before you speak, but it's also, we're removing you. We're trying to take away vote from the union presidents, from the people that are at highest positions, right? I mean, they exert influence, and if they're out of compliance and they continue to be out of compliance, eventually they will lose their ability to represent their constituents. And
yeah, I think the idea is one of fairness, right? Like when all the representatives of the entities of the church get together and make a decision, right? I mean, that's like, what's the point of doing that if we're not going to follow the decisions that are being made?
Right.
So if you continually persist in not playing the game, then well, why are you here, right? It would be, and the idea is to make that like a warning step between there and actually taking a whole structure out of the church, right? So that somebody would maybe this constituency would say, oh, we're in trouble here, right?
Right. So it kind of relies on the voice of the president. Then it's a little bit. That's how I kind of feel like that the president, he exerts most of the influence, and we will expect the presidents to be talking or to be expressing what their constituents are expressing. So we're not just kicking out one person, but we're also, kind of removing all of these people that support that individual.
So if you look at the new compliance document, it actually makes very clear in one spot explicitly that they want the president not only to represent his constituency, and I say his because that's kind of what this whole thing is about, right? Is whether we can actually have female leadership in the church. And they also make it clear that the president is expected to represent his higher level of organization.
So the employer.
In this case, not the employer. As a pastor, yes, that would be your employer. Sure. But this president is employed by his constituency as well. Okay. But the is expected to represent to the constituency the authority of the whole general conference group, all put together. That's what they want to do there.
That seems to me that you're putting a person in a pickle, like, in a very hard situation. You're asking them to represent the opinion of the constituency. And let's say that opinion is, in this case, to follow or interpret policy against the majority interpretation. And at the same time, you're asking that person to tell the constituency the majority interpretation of that policy. Let it be any issue. It doesn't have to be, in this case, one of the hot issues in the table is, of course, like the ordination of women or women in leadership, and that's something that we have been kind of walking through. But this person now needs to have two opinions and his own at the same time and representing those. So will this be dangerous for the church in the sense that, well, if you have this individual that is trying to represent a minority opinion of the policy with also represent the majority opinion, are we allowing them to decide for themselves, or are we just setting up a system that may encourage them to follow the majority in order for the minority not to lose their voice? Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, we come here and we're telling them, well, if you don't represent the majority, we're just going to take you away, which takes away the diversity, which takes away, some people will say, takes away the diversity, takes away conscience, takes away the ability to represent the various opinions within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And it kind of goes into a not unity, but more like uniformity kind of a model. Will that be fair to say?
I think the danger is slightly different than that. But I think it's related. Just to represent what these individuals who are proposing this plan are trying to do, I don't think they see it themselves as shutting down debate. I think what they see it as, once the debate is done and the decision is made, we need to kind of follow through, right? I think you can see this again on a local church board where you expect there to be vigorous discussion and all sides to be aired. But when a vote is made, we expect that church board members do not go around and say, that was the there needs to be some ability to coalesce around a decision that's been taken.
Now, when it comes to the decision that it's the hot topic in discussion, when it comes to women's ordination, we did not decide not to ordain women. We decided not to allow the divisions to decide that, right?
Yeah.
So even with this issue, we haven't closed the debate completely, because we recognize that the committee that revised the ordination practices and all that, it was kind of inconclusive to a certain degree. They didn't bring a recommendation like 100% recommendation, this should be abolished or this should not be practiced. And I think that there is room here to continue the debate. I don't think it's a closed issue. It's not like maybe even righteousness by faith. Like we could bring that back from 1888, right?
Yeah.
130 years now. Yeah. And we're still kind of debating that.
Right.
So how do we manage through that? And also like our own understanding of doctrine, our own understanding of the truth, that it moves, it continues to progress. So isn't it dangerous to say, well, we chose that in 2015 and that will never be revisited ever again? Is that in the spirit of Adventism, or is that just trying to shut down maybe something by the means of policy?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, I think you can never say this and be a sola scriptura Christian, right?
Correct.
Because as long as somebody could go to the Bible and say, look what I found, right, that has been overlooked, and they might be right. Yeah. We could be willing to back off of any position. Now, that might mean shutting down the Adventist church, right?
Right.
If one thing, if we just, we were wrong about this whole Sabbath thing, guys. There's actually been Sabbatarian churches that did that, right? Because so there also has to be a sense in which the organization needs to know the purpose for which it's founded, right? And be willing to stand on that, right? Which means taking some hard decisions in order to do so. So if a union were to follow the example of the Church of Christ and say, nope, it's not Sabbath anymore, it's Sunday. Sorry, guys, we messed up, right? We would have to take a hard decision and say, well, you're not really part of what this organization was founded to do, right? It's pretty well central. You have the right to do that based on the Bible. We can't take that away from you. But that has ramifications for now your relationship to this organizational entity that we call the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I don't think there would be any question, right? The moral authority would be there. If a union said we're doing it on Sunday now, we would say, all right, goodbye. It would hurt. They could take universities and hospital systems and educational systems with them, and we'd lose a lot of stuff. And there probably would be legal battles over how to disperse the problem. But we would
like a divorce.
We would, it's like a divorce. And I think that's the analogy. That's the correct analogy, because when you have that moral authority to move, you know that it's clear enough that we have to do the divorce. Now, on an issue like women's ordination, we just know it isn't that central to what it means to be Adventist, because no one is willing to make that move. Even the most ardent, they're not willing to go on a campaign to disfellowship everybody who believes in women's ordination. They're not willing to, just cut loose. They had a chance last year to do that. They could have brought that motion to the floor, but they knew it would be defeated. So the question is then, well, if we can't get a divorce, then how do we stop these folks from ordaining women? And the answer is, well, then we have to flip it. Instead of being an adult-adult relationship where we have a sisterhood of churches and they're in fellowship because they believe the Holy Spirit has brought them together, right? And we all have, the Holy Spirit. No one's above anybody else. Now we have to make it a parent-child relationship so that the elected leaders of the sisterhood of churches are now, instead of being understood as like their servants, are now their parents. And the unions are now the children of the parents. And the parents have to discipline these children in order to get them all in line.
Doesn't that run against even our own belief of, priesthood of all believers, or we're all equal? Wouldn't be then
well, this is the kingly power that we were warned against, isn't it? Right? Where we have elevated certain people into spiritual authority over us, right? When in fact it is the Holy Spirit speaking through the body that has spiritual authority in the church, right? And the leaders are there to facilitate that and keep it toward its purpose, right? So when you flip it into that parent-child relationship, then you get all these other funny dynamics going on where people feel like they're being oppressed and they have to rebel, and then people feel like they're in authority and they have to put down rebellion, and somehow we have to get back to an adult way of interacting with our other entities in the church.
Right. Yeah, even it seems to me, at least, that by flipping this from adult to adult-child, that's kind of out of compliance at the same time, because you're not treating the unions that, represent these bodies as equal, which is it's part of the manual, right? It's part of the GC handbook that is like, okay, we're all equal, right? Like there's some sections that kind of do give that provision. So will then they need to apply that on themselves? How far does it reach? Because
they want this to reach all the way up and down the organizational structure, for each level to create its compliance committees, to have those parents in place to discipline the children at the lower levels of the church. So really what you have done is not only set up a kind of a quasi bishop, but you also, because the bishop is the father of the church, right? But you also have kind of a quasi system. You've turned policy into quasi canon law, and then you have quasi inquisitions and canon lawyers who deliver the definitive interpretations of canon law and all this other stuff. So really, it's like moving from a system of good faith that we are all with the Holy Spirit to a system of compliance and control. And the reason is that we have made issues that are not central to being Adventists issues on which the General Conference should exercise authority.
That's very powerful. I mean, like right now I'm kind of reflecting on what you're saying, and it's very interesting that you're saying this, because as you're saying it, I remember one article that I read, and this is a hotly debated article by George Knight, right? Like, is that the fear that he's seeing? Like, that this is becoming something that is not the grassroots movement that we started back in, 1844, 1860s. Like, is that, to me, is a warrant of fear.
Well, it's not, and it can't be, and it shouldn't be, because it was meant to go around the world. And you can't run a worldwide church the same way you ran a business or a small fellowship of churches or a church network, or, it kind of went through stages. I'm kind of going back and forth across history with that. But Yeah, now I do have a problem with just plain out calling the church Babylon and the General Conference president a pope, because look, it's not it's not analogous in every way, right? I mean, the pope then doesn't have votes go against him, right? Like that's just now there are ways that feedback happens in the Catholic Church, and we don't have time to discuss all their church politics, which is even more like. But for our purposes, I don't think it's fair to make those comparisons in a unequivocal way, right? But I think the comparison is illuminating in certain regards. If we do the detailed analysis first, and then say, okay, how is this in ways like what goes on in the Catholic Church?
It's mainly like and I believe also that he may have gone a little bit too far in certain areas. And it's just like, it's kind of like a wake up call to be like, okay, guys, we don't want to get there.
Yeah.
But we need to kind of deal with this on our own and kind of get back to this equal standing to give the union presidents and the division presidents the same kind of voice and not kind of censorship. Okay. So what do you expect for it to happen? What do you expect to happen coming up this week?
I will not make any predictions. I can't answer that question. Instead, I'll answer the question I wish I was asked, which is, does this make some people in the church the good guys and others the bad guys, right?
Good.
Like, are we in North America and Europe the noble people standing up for true Adventism, and the rest of the poor benighted unions in the rest of the world just don't really get what this whole thing was supposed to be about? Right. And I worry that even if we wouldn't want to say that, our rhetoric sometimes betrays that opinion. I can't imagine that union presidents elsewhere in the world really like this approach either. And the question is, why do they feel they have no choice but to have this kind of leadership in the church? And I cannot get inside their heads and answer that for you. But I think that we have not attended well enough to dimensions of class as a church. I think we're starting to get there a little bit with culture. Even though, as I listen to many of our North American leadership people speak in these annual councils, I get the impression that they've never had to get a room full of people from different cultures to agree with each other. I could be mistaken on that, but having been in multicultural church leadership, I don't get that impression myself that they've been there. But our missions people have just started to attend to culture. But I think we don't understand the impact of class on a global scale, and what a culture war looks like when you bring class into it. And if I can just lay that out briefly, in conclusion, the family is the central symbol of, one of the central symbols of global culture war, right? Where when you live in conditions that are poor and insecure, you make sense of the family in a rather different way than when you live in conditions that are rather wealthy and relatively secure. And this is kind of a sociological analysis. But when you're in this poor and insecure condition, what you find is family structures where the family is made sense of as a unit with a mother and a father, the father having certain special privileges that keep him really bound in. And the purpose of the family is to make a lot of kids, right? There's another option there, which is a family unit in which is the mother and her children, and men float in and out of the picture, but that's not really a biblical model. Correct. And so in these places in the world, or in these and you can't just divide this up, here in North America and everybody else, because look, there's pockets in North America that make sense of the family in that poor and insecure way. And there's places in all other countries in the world where they have the opposite approach, which is when you derive it from the traditional family, make sense of the family as a union of two people, of two equals, for their mutual benefit and flourishing.
Okay.
Right? And it is the place where you should raise kids if you want to have kids, but kids are really there as a part of your self-actualization, your mutual self-actualization, right? Kids are something that is fulfilling in life, right? So, but if that's not what you want, you do your thing, right? Whatever's fulfilling.
Yes.
Two different ways of making sense of the family. And in a culture war situation, you're trying to demonstrate the superiority of your family model to say we have moral grounds on which to rule, right? On which to be the dominant culture here.
Yes.
And when you toss women's ordination into that ongoing global culture war and just try to make sense of it and say, okay, everybody just go to the Bible and see what the Bible says. Well, the Bible doesn't say to ordain women. It doesn't say not to ordain women. Oh, well, then we have to look at spirit of prophecy. Well, it doesn't say to ordain women. It doesn't say not to ordain women, right? So anything else is an inference. And when you start making inferences, you're making sense of your reasoning against a certain background of your experiences and all that. And then your family model comes into play, right? And so some people start making sense of it this way and say it's biblical, and some people make sense of it that way and say it's biblical. And we've gotten ourselves into quite a battle over this thing. And the question is, how do we extract ourselves? And I don't think it is by saying we are the good guys and they are the bad guys, because that just perpetuates the culture war. It makes it, because in a culture war, it's kind of zero sum, right? And then anything becomes justified in order to protect our culture, right? So if there's some leaders there who are hard taskmasters, well, so be it. That's what we need to protect our turf, right? So I really would like us to try to put ourselves in the shoes of people who are very much unlike us in the church, even though we cannot often morally make sense of family relationships the way they do, because we just haven't lived their experience. We need to put ourselves as far as possible and say, okay, well, why might they be doing these sorts of things? Why might they be making sense of the Bible in this way? And then how can I bring the Bible against my view of the family and my view of women's ordination? Because if they're getting stuff wrong about it, maybe I am too, because I don't think the biblical model of the family is either one of those, right?
It seems different.
We need to create some space there where we can take a principled approach and stop fighting one another over this. Rant over.
No, that's good. It's a very good reflection, I think. And what I kind of gather from that is that it's not necessarily it's not a combative debate. It's more like, let's dialogue and, let's put each other, face to face. It's like when, philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, he kind of speaks about the power that you have when you face the other.
Yeah.
When you start interacting with the other, that you cannot escape the reality of, hey, you see their need, you see their opinion, you see that they may be there's a difference between you and him or her, but it is then at the place that when you're seeing the other person, when you're interacting with the other person, when you're putting yourself in their shoes, that you can start making maybe a better idea or better sense of your opinion, their opinion, and maybe a way forward.
Yeah,
it's that compromise per se.
And that is a tremendous challenge in a global church.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Because there's language barriers, there's travel barriers and all this stuff. One of the things that I've been pleased to see from my own union conference president there in Canada is I just saw pictures of him on Facebook going through Africa, looking at all the ADRA projects that ADRA Canada is involved in, right? Just, he didn't have to do that, right? Didn't look like it was a comfortable trip. Might have been a fun trip. Yeah. But just going over there and meeting people and saying, hey, here's what we are in North America. How can we benefit you? Right? I think we need a lot more of that in our church. And then when we're over there, being willing to have some of those difficult conversations, but in a spirit of Christian brotherhood, right? I think if more of the Global North Union presidents were going out to the Global South, the Global South Union presidents were going out to the Global North to work together in mission and fellowship, I think that would take care of at least 50% of this problem.
Wow. That's very good and very strong suggestion. I mean, it's actually very powerful. But that's what I mean by strong. It's like I think that's a good way to put it. Conversation and interaction, and not just look at it from a perspective of like we meet once a year.
Yeah.
And like all of the sudden,
and sit in our own division. Like if you look how they sit in there, it's by division.
It's like the Senate.
I'll bet you if you went in the I'll bet you anything. If you went in the cafeteria between those meetings, they'd still be sitting by division.
Right.
Right. So where does the brotherhood?
Right.
Where does the sweet spirit take place across these aisles?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree with you, and I think that's something that we need to see more within our divisions, within our churches. Sit with people that, hey, that's not your usual cafeteria, table. Go to the other one and dialogue and see how things are on the other side. Well, David, thank you very much for your time. I said it's our custom here at Disruptive Adventism. We give our guests the final word. So if you want to give us maybe a short what to look for or maybe a final advice when it comes to this whole conversation about annual council.
Yeah, I kind of took that on my own, didn't I? I don't know if I have much more to say, except that when you enter into church politics, it's a zone that requires you to be very spiritually fortified, because otherwise you get discouraged very quickly. Okay. So for anyone who's made it this far through the podcast, attend to your spiritual life first, before you watch any meetings or follow anything on Twitter or read any articles on the Adventist media or whatever. Be with the Lord, be in prayer, be praying for His church. That is where the life of the church happens. The business of the church is just to facilitate that connection between us and God for everyone on this planet. So have that in your heart before you go and do any business.
That was our discussion about annual council with David Hamstra. We hope that this podcast has sparked interest and that you follow closely the events unraveling this week. We will have another podcast on Friday reviewing some of the votes and how these meetings have turned out. Thank you for listening today. We appreciate that you have taken the time to listen to our podcast and ask that you share it with others. Please leave a review on iTunes or your favorite podcatching app. If you're enjoying our content, we want to invite you to consider contributing to our cause by becoming a Patreon, where you will receive exclusive content, have the ability to sit down with the Disruptive Adventism team, and ask relevant questions for Adventism and society. If you're interested in contributing, head to patreon.com/Disruptive Adventism. Another avenue for contribution is to purchase our merchandise through Amazon or tpublic.com. You can find the links for merchandise on our Facebook or Instagram pages. We also hope that our content has intrigued you a little bit and that you decide to stay around for future podcasts. If you have any comment, feedback, or a topic you would like us to discuss, please go to our website at www.disruptiveadventism.org or shoot us an email to disruptiveadventism@gmail.com. We're eager to engage in discussions about any matter, so don't hesitate to contact us. This has been it for today. We hope you join us next time. And as always, we invite you to be disruptive.